Welcome to the Home for Innovation. I wanted to make sure you guys were aware that recently all of the Republican presidential candidates were invited to Iowa to speak in a question and answer a program that was hosted by NAM, National Association of Manufacturers. So all the questions there were specific to manufacturing and what strategies they might employ were they to become president. Unfortunately, not all of them showed up, which may be a message in and of itself. But check out some of the highlights from those who did come.
With only weeks remaining until the first votes are cast in the 2012 election process, Republican presidential candidates discuss their plans for business and manufacturing.
What I want to do is change and reform the tax code. Again, I'm a private businesswoman. My husband and I started our own profitable company. We think profit's a good thing. And also, as a tax lawyer, number one, we have to reform the tax code. I want to have a flatter, fair, more simple tax code, and we have a proven model with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, and so mine borrows from those principles. But then also, I will repeal Obamacare. I am committed to that. I introduced the bill in Congress, and I've been fighting for this, and also Dodd-Frank. I wrote that bill as well to repeal Dodd-Frank. We've got to have a moratorium on any further regulatory burden.
How do those domestic policies, though, increase international opportunities for manufacturers like Vermeer?
Well, excellent question. The reason, the way that it does is that it creates certainty for manufacturers. Right now, manufacturers look at the Dodd-Frank bill, the Jobs and Housing Destruction Act, and they look at Obamacare, and both of those bills together say, hey, that's a lot of costs for me. Those are a lot of unwritten rules, and these are two bills that will never finish being written. So it is the mother of all nightmare on regulatory burden. That's costs. That's all it is. Government is a cost of doing business. Dodd-Frank is a terribly high cost, as is Obamacare.
But at the same time, the bright spot in the economy in the third quarter has been exports. Despite Dodd-Frank, despite Obamacare, as you say, we have seen exports continue to increase.
We have, and that's what we want to continue. Part of that is because we finally passed the 3 free trade agreements. I traveled to Colombia, I met with President Santos, and he said essentially to me, what's wrong with people in Congress? Don't they see how this will benefit manufacturing? Don't they see how this will benefit ag? Well, of course, we need market share because 95% of the consumers are outside of the United States. We have to grow our share, not inhibit it. And so that's why I was pleased to vote for those 3 free trade agreements. But we have a dozen others that are out currently being negotiated, both free trade and fair trade. We have to remember both aspects, but the United States is only involved in one, so we can step up our game too.
Talking about competing in the world marketplace, when I was governor before, we were able to attract 6 automotive component parts companies from Canada to Iowa. We got IPSCO Steel locate here, Skyjack, and many other Canadian companies. About 2 months ago, I was in Illinois where they're raising taxes, encouraging companies to move to Iowa. And one of these companies said, you know, we like what you have to say and what you're doing about reducing the tax and regulatory burden in Iowa, but we're concerned about the federal tax burden.
Yes.
When I was governor before, the Canadian dollar is worth 65, 70 cents. Now it's par with the American dollar.
That's right.
Their financial institutions are stronger, and they've reduced their taxes. Their federal corporate taxes are lower than ours, and they're going to go from 18% to 15%. What do you think we need to do to compete with Canada and other countries so that we don't have American companies moving their operations north of the border?
Well, you just explained why you got reelected governor. There's no, that's exactly why you did. And we need to do the same things. I had met with a muffler manufacturer down in Des Moines, and he has a plant in Des Moines, and he has one in Canada. And he said, look, I had a decision to make. I saw all the out-of-control spending, the debt accumulation. I don't see the corporate tax rate going down. We're the second highest corporate tax rate in the world. He said Canada had an 18% corporate tax rate in 2010. I purchased a $1 million piece of equipment. I could either put it up in my Canada plant or in my Iowa plant. He said I sent it to Canada. When I sent that piece of equipment, I sent jobs with it too. I hated to do it, but it's because of corporate tax rate. That's why I want to make the United States one of the most competitive corporate tax rates in the world. And essentially, my plan is to make the United States the best place to do business for manufacturing. Our family, I was born and raised in Iowa, and my dad's job was in manufacturing. He worked for the Chamberlain Corporation in Waterloo, Iowa, and they are no more. And unfortunately, too many manufacturers have left Iowa and the United States for better climates to do business. That has to change.
Do you support cutting or eliminating a tax on repatriated profits that American companies bring back?
I support zeroing out the repatriation. If we would zero that out, because profits are stimulus. That's the true stimulus, our profits. So we want to bring that $1.2 trillion from overseas here to the United States.
And would companies be able to use that money for any purpose they see fit?
Without a doubt, it's their money.
Including stock buybacks and dividends?
Anything they want to spend, use it for.
You attach a mandatory training requirement to all unemployment compensation. And you say, if you need unemployment compensation, fine, but you have to sign up for a business-offered job training program. If you had 99 weeks of unemployment, that's the associate degree. In 99 weeks, you could train virtually anybody. You establish the principle, we do not give people money for doing nothing.
Where does the funding come from for the training?
You go to the businesses. You say to every business in this country, we're going to provide you free personnel. You can offer distance learning. You look at the University of Phoenix, you look at Kaplan, you look at what the National Association of Manufacturers has done with distance learning. But you say to people, if you took the amount of time we have paid people to do nothing for the last 6 years, you would have the highest human capital in the world in the American workforce. Now, you combine that, as I do at newt.org, with 100% expensing for all new equipment, so you could write it off in 1 year. And you'll now have the most modern manufacturing equipment in the world with the best trained workforce in the world. And at that point, you tell the Chinese that you know they have a crisis and you'll try to counsel them.
What's the direction of American wages at that time? And what's the direction of American wages at that time, and what does that do to the competitiveness for manufacturers?
If you have the best trained workforce in the world with the most modern equipment in the world, wages go up because your productivity goes up. You know, there's a study that just came out of the Boston Consulting Group, I think it's in August, that says by 2015, South Carolina and Alabama will be less expensive than coastal manufacturing in China if you take total cost. Because it's not just what do you pay the person, but it's what's the cost of the equipment, what's the cost of logistics, what's the cost of all the other factors. There's no reason we can't rebuild America at a remarkable speed. We've done it before, you know, but we have to have a totally new attitude in Washington. And frankly, as the governor knows, in states, in local communities, I mean, we're not going to remain the post-World War II America coasting because we're so dominant. We're going to have to go through a period of very fundamental change in our policies and in our institutions.
To that point, let me ask you about long-term unemployment. Apologies, Governor, but I need to follow up here. Long-term unemployment, almost 40 to 50% of people who are unemployed today have been unemployed for 6 months or longer. Is that a structural economic issue? In other words, is there something structurally wrong with the U.S. economy that people are not able to find jobs?
Yeah, look, there's something very structurally wrong with the U.S. economy. It's called the U.S. government. I mean, when you have a Food and Drug Administration which cripples your ability to bring new products to market, you have an Environmental Protection Agency that runs around Iowa trying to convince farmers there shouldn't be dust on dirt roads. You have, and driving up the price of electricity everywhere in America. You have an anti-petroleum and anti-coal administration in the richest country in the world for energy. You have a tax code which is anti-manufacturing. You have a labor department which is anti-manufacturing. You have a National Labor Relations Board that wants to put Boeing out of business in South Carolina. I mean, go down the list. This country has been maniacally anti-jobs. Obama is a left-wing radical who believes in class warfare, and then he's surprised that everybody who he's attacking doesn't create jobs. What did he think was going to happen? I mean, you can't go around the country and blame everybody who creates jobs and then say, now, gee, why don't you go out and take the risk with your capital and spend the next 5 years of your life creating jobs so I can attack you even more?
As governor, and there's a whole lot of new Republican governors that came in across the upper Midwest, we've been working to reduce the tax and regulatory burden, bring jobs to our states, but we've been hearing concerns that, well, the tax burden at the federal level, and the regulatory burden, you've already talked about the regulatory burden, but that federal corporate income tax and the penalty for bringing profits back from overseas is causing a lot of American companies to say, maybe we ought to just move our whole operation to Canada or some other foreign country instead of investing and creating jobs here. What would you do about that?
Well, I mean, first of all, your analysis is exactly right. And by the way, here, you had a great year with the budget. I mean, you've done a great job of getting Iowa back on track again. And if Washington were doing as well as you're doing, we'd all be at 4% unemployment and happy as we could be. One, you should repeal Dodd-Frank immediately. It is killing small banks. It is killing small business. It is killing housing. 2, you should repeal Sarbanes-Oxley. I just had a major multinational say to me they'd love to be headquartered in the U.S. It would cost them 2% of gross sales for compliance. And Sarbanes-Oxley produces no useful information, produced none in 2008. 3, I think you've got to look at a fundamentally new tax code. At newt.org and our proposed 21st century contract with America, I'm for zero capital gains tax, which would bring hundreds of billions of dollars back in the U.S. and would mean zero capital gains tax also at the corporate level. I am for eliminating double taxation of dividends. I'm for a 12.5% corporate tax rate, which is the Irish tax rate, which would liberate, I think, about 700 billion of the trillion two that's currently locked up overseas. As I said earlier, I'm for 100% expensing of new equipment, abolishing the death tax, and an optional 15% flat tax on the Hong Kong model, where they have for years now allowed you either to keep the current deductions or go to a flat tax. And they found it to be a very successful model to let people make the choice.
What role should the federal government play in developing, promoting, and retaining American know-how?
Well, that's actually what my whole tax plan is all about. We actually understand that we're still innovating here in America, except we're not producing what's being innovated here. And it's one of the reasons that you see these Wall Street protesters, and they're concerned that, sort of the middle of America is being hollowed out, that the wealth that's being created by the innovators is not trickling down, if you will, to those who would make those products. And so I've actually focused my tax plan on manufacturing. And I've been traveling across the country talking about just what Marianne Dringa was talking about, which is we have an industry that has a great multiplier effect in the economy, and it's manufacturing. And if there's one thing I hear when I go out across the country, it says we need made in America again. We need to make more things in America again. And it's not just that pride of making things, but it is the opportunity for those at the bottom end of the income scale to be able to get the jobs. And I think the average manufacturing job earns about $20,000 more than non-manufacturing jobs. That means folks at the bottom end in the middle can move up that income scale. And if we create a competitive environment, I've heard some candidates talk about, well, we need a trade war with China. No, we don't. We need to just beat them. We need to have an environment here that can attract those jobs back from China and the new innovative products to be made here. So I put together a plan that I know some people, Rick Perry just talked about a 20% corporate tax. When it comes to manufacturers and processors, we would zero out the corporate tax. We'd say there would be no corporate tax for people who make things here in America. That would be job number one. Governor, you just asked about repatriation of profits. If you repatriate profits, and there's estimated of $1.5 trillion potentially sitting in overseas accounts and repatriated and profits over there, you bring those back and you invest them in plant and equipment in America, you pay zero. You pay nothing. Now,
so you put the requirement that repatriated money would have to be invested.
I have 2 levels. Number one, if you bring it back for any reason, I agree with the 5.25% tax, which is what we used back in, I think, 2004, and I was one of the authors of that bill to move that forward. But if you invest it in plant and equipment, you can show that money, if you show that investment going into creating jobs here in America instead of dividends, which is not a bad thing. I'm not complaining about it. But if you're going to put that to work to create American jobs, you're not going to pay any taxes on it, because the benefit to the economy and the tax revenues that will flow from that deployment will be, as Mary mentioned, have a multiplying effect. 3, there's one thing the president can do right away, and that is you can't go in and say, I'm going to change the tax code, or I'm going to change this law or change that law. But you can, as the governor knows, you can repeal regulations. You can change regulations. That's all within the purview of the President of the United States. And so what I've said is that every regulation that the Obama administration has put in place that costs businesses more than $100 million, I'll repeal. We'll repeal every one of them. Some we'll have to replace. And as the governor knows, it takes a little longer when you repeal and replace. But there are a lot of those regulations there right now that are punitive that the administration has put in place that we can get rid of completely. And if you make capital available, you make it profitable because you eliminate the tax burden, and you create a regulatory environment where businesses can, where manufacturers can compete, will offset that 20% disadvantage that manufacturers have, excluding labor costs, the 20% disadvantage that our manufacturers have here in this country vis-a-vis our big trade competitors. And we'll create jobs here.
In the last week, a number of manufacturers like Honeywell and United Technologies have said they're increasing their restructuring budgets for this quarter and into the next year, not because of the regulatory environment, because of uncertainty certain economic conditions. So again, the question is, which we posed to Governor Perry, is how does that address end consumer demand, which most economists point to, that's why the job market has been weak?
Well, first off, if you create more efficiencies and more profitability for companies and they can hire more people, then you're going to have more economic activity, more people are going to go to work, and that's going to create more consumer demand. The rest of our tax plan actually lowers all the rates, simplifies the code, and puts more money in people's pockets too. So, and the other thing is, look, I think Newt, in joking, said this the other night in Des Moines. You know, the minute a Republican president and a Republican Congress are elected, the attitude in this country is going to change in the business community. You're going to see the attitude of consumers change. You're going to see an upward arc of markets and this economy, because the crushing burden of a government knows best, Washington-run system that Barack Obama and the Democrats have put in place is going to be over. You know, the president going around the country beating up on businesses, beating up on people who are successful investing has an impact. If you look at Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression, he did the same thing, and it had a real dampening effect on the economy of this country. That attitude will change under a Santorum administration.
What you have to do is be more competitive, and we're less competitive to be the world producer, because we have too much taxes, too much regulation. But it's also involved with a monetary system. When a country becomes the issuer of the reserve currency of the world, unfortunately, the biggest export is money. So there's a temptation to buy from overseas, increase your current account deficit, and then you go to consumption. That is our disease. We've been doing that ever since we've been issuing this paper currency since 1970. It's gradually getting much worse. So if you don't look at the regulations, the taxation, trade policy, and monetary policy, this is going to continue to get much worse.
To the point of monetary policy, Congressman Bachmann mentioned a 2.5% economic growth in the third quarter, largely driven by the consumer, but also exports were strong. Exporters like Vermeer have been taking advantage of the weaker U.S. dollar. In fact, Vermeer says that part of the reason they were able to sign the big contract this week was because of the lower dollar. The international buyer was able to take advantage of this.
Yeah, when you get a lower dollar, it works for a little while, but it's not a solution. It's just temporary. And when you have everybody putting their money at different rates, everybody has competing devaluations. But it only lasts because we already see price inflation coming back here. So you lower the dollar, prices go up, and it cancels out the temporary benefits. So we really have to start talking about, if you want a more balanced trade and a fairer trade system, you have to have a commodity standard of currency. Otherwise, you will always have these competing devaluations, and then everybody's going to be unhappy, and then they're going to ask for trade wars. And we've already started. Look, there are tariffs being put. Brazil has put a 30% tariff on Chinese goods. Mm-hmm. So the trade wars will be devastating. So the only way you can solve that is solve the problem with the currencies and the devaluations.
Do you support the trade deals that were just signed
with
Panama, Colombia, and South Korea?
I support the lowest tariffs of anybody in the Congress. I want the freest trade possible. I never vote for sanctions. I want to trade with Cuba. But I do not like international arrangements because it is sacrificing our sovereignty. The WTO is, you know, on occasion they give us lower tariffs, but most of the time, more times than not, you go there to retaliate. And I'm not for that. I'm not for another level of government. And under the Constitution, trade policy is to be designed, you know, by the Congress. Hey, it is not to be designed by a body that is created by Congress and give the authority to the executive branch. So no, I don't like the international trade agreements. I just like low tariffs, as low as possible, as quickly as possible, and get out of it. A lot of people who preach free trade are the ones who are the first ones to put on sanctions, so they're hypocritical about some of these free trade agreements.
You like low tariffs. You also like lower taxes at the federal government. The federal corporate income tax is a real burden. We're being told that that's put us in an uncompetitive situation.
Absolutely.
Especially with the penalty then for bringing profits back from overseas. What would you do about that?
Zero tax on people who want to repatriate their money. And as a modest start, I would put the corporate tax at 15%. We would become more competitive.
That put us equal with where Canada's going to be.
Yeah, I want them very low because in many ways, they think that the corporate tax, if you lower corporate tax, only the executive is going to benefit. But the consumer benefits too. Corporate taxes are a form of a sales tax. They do have to, if they're competitive, they have to pass this on. So I'm low taxes, but you can't get low taxes unless you deal with the big problem, That's big spending. And that's where I think so many come up short. They're not willing to talk about significant cuts in spending.
You've been really bold in that, and you want to kind of share with us a little more detail, because I think you've got the boldest plan to reduce the federal deficit. I think most Americans are scared to death. They've seen this country become a huge debtor nation. We see the federal debt go up 1.3, 1.4 trillion year after year. We know this is not affordable, not sustainable, and you have a plan to deal with that.
Well, we have two debts. We have the foreign debt, which is the biggest in the history of the world, and that's one subject. But the national debt is now $15 trillion, and it's unsustainable. And we get into a mess because of this, and everybody in Washington thinks the solution is spending more money. But the best example to realize why you have to cut spending is what happened after World War II. They cut spending 60%. They cut taxes 30%. They brought 10 million people back home, and the economy boomed. It was taken out of the government, put into the economy. No, I have a proposal to cut $1 trillion, cut 5 departments, and significantly cut and put all that money back into the business community and the private community. Government expenditures just doesn't work. But the real reason is taxes. Spending is a tax. You either tax the people, you borrow the money, or you print the money. It's always a tax, so spending has to come under control. And this idea that the economy would collapse is absolutely false. The economy would blossom if you cut taxes and spending.
Well, there are a number of parts of not only my jobs plan, but my tax plan. I want to talk about the jobs plan first, about getting Americans back to work on the energy side of things without having to go to Congress, without asking anything, signing my name to executive orders and to executive actions. You could open up these western lands for our energy side of things and putting some people back to work almost immediately. When you look and see what's happened in North Dakota, Terry, when you see what's happened in the Marcellus Shale up in Pennsylvania and places in Texas where they've opened up these new shale plays, get our coal industry back to, this president of the United States he's at war against the coal industry. So getting Americans to work almost immediately is my goal, and I got a pretty good record of that. Terry and I compete against each other from the standpoint of state against state, and we've created over 1 million net new jobs while I've been the governor of Texas, and this president has overseen 2.5 million jobs being killed, and it's been more off of the regulatory side. When you think about Obamacare, when you think about the EPA, I don't know what Vermeer has to add to the cost of one of these pieces of equipment right here just because of EPA, but I'll guarantee you it is a substantial amount of money.
Governor
and
Perry,
I pull back every one of those regulations since 2008 and check them for cost versus benefit, and nearly all of them are going to get pitched out because the benefit is going to be minuscule relative to the cost.
Governor Perry, Whirlpool, when it announced those 5,000 job cuts, they didn't cite regulations, though. The company cited consumer demand. That was why they were cutting jobs here in the United States.
But you understand why there's consumer demand being lost out there. I mean, the people have lost confidence, Mary, that they can go and risk their capital. I mean, that's what's going on in America. For 3 years, we've had a president of the United States that has sent a clear message that they do not believe in the free market enterprise of which I grew up with. They believe that if we would stimulate the economy with more federal money, that if we would pitch more dollars out into the economy, that it would create jobs. We know that doesn't work. In Texas or in Iowa or whatever state it is, we know that the way that you create jobs is by not overtaxing, over-regulating, or over-litigating, and then the small businessmen and women, or for that matter, somebody like Whirlpool, a big business, they know that they have the confidence they can risk their capital, have a chance to have a return on investment, and they hire people. And at that particular point in time, that's how you take an economy off. It's worked in the state of Texas for a decade. I think we're like the 15th largest economy in the world. If it'll work in Texas, it'll work in this country.
Governor, your state leads the country in terms of wind generation, and we are a state that also generates a lot of our electricity from wind. We're up to 20% Iowa.
Quick on our tail.
What we would like to know, the wind energy tax credit is going to expire. It has expired 3 times previously. Senator Grassley has been a real champion of this. We would like to see it extended for 4 years. Would you support extending that? And also, would you support retaining the renewable energy standard, which has helped us reduce our dependency on foreign oil.
Right. I happen to believe that the federal government needs to be completely out of the energy business, picking winners and losers. And let me share with you why. In exchange to get rid of all of those regulations that are out there, and whether you're in the oil and gas business and the tax credits that they get, whether you're in the ethanol business and the renewable fuel standard, or whether you're in the wind side, from Washington, D.C., I do not think it is the federal government's business to be picking winners and losers, frankly, in any of our energy sources. I mean, these two solar debacles that we've seen are pretty good examples of that. But if a state wants to, which is what we did, Terry, we put into place in the state of Texas an incentive for renewables, and the wind energy came in and took great advantage of that. It's the reason we became the #1 wind energy producing state in the country. I think if states want to compete against each other by putting those types of standards, those types of incentives in place, that is a correct and a proper role for the state. But at the federal level, I do not believe that the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. ought to be picking winners and losers in the energy industry, or for that matter in any other industry. They ought to get back to doing what they ought to have been doing, which is standing a good military and securing our border, and then let the states work out the rest of most of these things.
Governor, I know we have a question from the audience on energy. Before we get to that, what role should the federal government play in supporting research and development within the energy industry?
R&D is the one place that I would allow the federal government to continue to be engaged and to give those credits, because that's where the private sector is going to come up with the new ways to burn coal cleaner. They're going to come up with the new ways to use the DDGs in a new and exciting way for the feeding industry. They're going to be the ones that come up with the technology on the solar side or on the wind side, or energy sources that we haven't even thought of yet.
Well, hopefully these interviews give you some insight into the direction that these Republican candidates for president might take the country. And remember, here at the Home for Innovation, we believe that real wealth equals manufacturing, and manufacturing equals real wealth. Keep your eye on the ball. We'll see you here next time.